You were never supposed to hear this because it was never meant to escape the mountains, and once it does, it cannot be unheard. Picture a hollow in West Virginia at dawn, the fog curling like a shroud around a house that leans as if even the earth wants to spit it out. Inside, a woman labors, and a child is born. The cry does not sound like life. It sounds like a wound, gasping through human flesh. The midwife does not ask about the father, because the truth is, everyone in that house already is. Every line of blood crosses itself until there is no beginning and no end, only a circle. This is not just poverty, and it is not just tragedy. It is design, a family locked into itself until the body becomes a prison for the past. The Whittakers became infamous for their silence, for their growls, for their stares that seemed to look past the present into something broken and ancient. But what most do not understand is that their story is not just biology, it is not just inbreeding. It is a mirror of what happens when a system chooses to erase a people by leaving them to rot in forgotten valleys. America sells the dream of progress but buries the cost. In towns, no one maps, and families no one saves. The Whittakers are not monsters. They are evidence. Evidence that when isolation mixes with neglect, and when neglect mixes with secrecy, you do not just create deformity of the body, you create deformity of the spirit, and that deformity speaks in silence. Theirs is a silence that unsettles television crews, a silence that made interviewers nervous, because behind those eyes was a truth older than laws. They are a wound stitched shut so tightly that when it seeps through, it terrifies those who have never seen the underside of a nation that hides its failures in human form. And if you think this is just about one strange family, you are wrong. This is about what happens when an entire society decides that certain blood lines are not worth saving. The Whittaker house is not only a home, it is a mausoleum of secrets. Every wall carries the weight of generations trapped in cycles chosen for them. And tonight you and I will walk deeper into that mausoleum. But remember, once you start down this path, you cannot turn back. Because what is hidden here has a way of infecting those who dare to know. When outsiders first came to see the Whittakers, they expected horror. But what they found was something more unsettling than any horror story. Because horror ends, but this was living, breathing, unfinished, and ongoing. The house itself looked like it was collapsing into the earth, wood gray and warped like bones left too long in the sun. Broken windows patched with plastic doors that creaked like coffins. Every sound whispered decay. Inside there were no polished floors, no modern furniture, only sagging couches, stained carpets, flickering lights that hummed like nervous insects every corner, heavy with the smell of damp and dust. But the family was not afraid of this space because it was all they had ever known. Their speech, or the lack of it, became the first mystery to visitors. Some grunted, some barked, some stared for minutes without blinking, and others seemed trapped in bodies that could not translate thought into words. This silence unsettled cameramen. It made interviewers sweat because they were expecting answers but got only echoes of a world that language had abandoned. And yet, within that silence, there was history. Because their ancestors had married brother to sister, cousin to cousin, generation after generation, sealing themselves inside a genetic loop until the body could no longer carry its own weight without showing cracks. People whispered words like cursed, freakish, unnatural, but the truth was more disturbing than that, because this was not some ancient legend or medieval bloodline. This was modern America. This was the result of neglect, the result of forgetting a family in a valley where no roads led out. And here lies the paradox, because while the outside world judged them, they also fed on their image as entertainment. Journalists turned them into spectacle documentaries, turned their suffering into curiosity clicks, views, likes, while ignoring the deeper wound of abandonment that created them. If you look closely at their eyes, you see not just deformity, but a quiet pleading, as if they are asking, "Do you see us? Now, do you see what has been done to us? Do you see how a system can erase people not with guns, but with silence?" The Whittakers became a mirror, not just for a broken family, but for a broken society, because in their isolation lies the proof that progress is selective, that America builds cities on one hand and creates forgotten graves on the other. And now, as we descend deeper into their story, you will see that what lies behind their walls is not just genetic decay, but psychological decay. Secrets passed down with every generation, secrets that were never meant to leave that hollow valley. Every family carries secrets, but the Whittakers carried them in their bodies, in their silence, in the way they looked at you without looking through you, without ever speaking the words that burned behind their eyes. It is said that the family was so isolated that strangers rarely appeared, and when they did, they were chased off. Not with violence, but with stares and sounds that made the bravest men uneasy. Growls, barks, guttural noises that seemed more animal than human, yet were all too human. Once you realized they came from pain, those sounds became the family's language, a language born not from culture or choice, but from bloodlines tightening until words broke apart like glass under pressure. Neighbors told stories of how the Whittakers would appear suddenly in town, walking together in strange silence, their clothes mismatched, their faces unreadable, and how people would whisper and point, but never speak directly to them. Because what could you say to a family that looked like they had stepped out of another time, another world? And yet behind those stares, behind those fractured sounds, there was memory. The memory of a mother who had begun it all, a woman who believed blood should not mix with outsiders, who believed that purity meant survival, even if it meant decay. Generations later, her choice was carved into every movement of her descendants, every blank stare, every sound that replaced a word, every awkward shuffle down a broken porch step. But while the outside world judged, they never asked why. They never asked what happens to a people when they are left without schools, without roads, without medicine, without connection. They never asked if isolation was chosen or if it was forced by poverty and geography, and a society that had no place for the forgotten. The cameras that entered their home captured faces that people labeled monstrous. But if you watched long enough, you could see something. Hingas. You could see a tenderness, a strange loyalty to each other, a bond that outsiders could never break. Because when the world abandoned them all they had was each other. And that is what makes their story darker than any headline, because it is not only about inbreeding, not only about deformity, it is about what happens when a society chooses who deserves to be seen and who deserves to vanish into the cracks of history. The Whittakers were not monsters. They were the mirror showing us the cost of neglect, the cost of secrets, and the cost of forgetting those who cannot escape the cages built around them. The deeper you look into the Whittaker story, the more it begins to feel less like a family history and more like a curse, a chain of choices repeated until the links became unbreakable. In the hills of West Virginia, where dirt roads cut through silence and forgotten houses wrought into the earth, the Whittakers became both legend and warning, whispered about by neighbors who said things they could never prove and feared things they could not understand. People spoke of strange encounters, of hearing noises in the woods at night that were neither animal nor human, of catching glimpses of figures watching from broken windows, of feeling a weight in the air whenever they passed the Whittaker home, a place where time had stopped and life seemed frozen in an endless cycle. The family's reputation grew darker with every generation, and soon they were no longer seen as individuals, but as symbols of decay, as if the sins of isolation and inbreeding had erased their humanity, leaving behind only a spectacle for the outside world to stare at. But the truth was more complex. The Whittakers were not creatures. They were survivors holding on to life in the only way they knew, with loyalty to blood above all else. Because when the outside world left them behind, blood was all they had. Still, their silence and their sounds, their growls and their stares made them easy to turn into monsters. And when cameras finally arrived to document their lives, the world did not see human beings. It saw a freak show, it saw entertainment, it saw shock value and horror without context. And that is perhaps the darkest secret of all. Not that the Whittakers lived in isolation, but that the world outside turned them into a story, stripped of dignity and humanity, reduced to clicks, headlines, and whispers. They became a modern myth, America's most famous inbred family, and yet behind the myth stood real people with memories, with love, with fear, with the same fragile threads of humanity that connect all families, even the broken ones. To look into their eyes was to see the cost of choices made long before their birth, choices made by a mother who believed blood should stay within itself, choices that grew into branches of a family tree, twisting back upon itself until it could no longer bear fruit without breaking. There are whispers that the Whittaker family carried more than just the burden of isolation. Some say their bloodline was haunted, not by ghosts, but by the weight of decisions passed down like a curse written into their very bodies. The haulers of West Virginia were a prison of mountains, a place where escape was nearly impossible, and where silence carried the power to swallow entire stories whole. In that silence, the Whittakers lived cut off from progress, from strangers, from the kind of change that reshapes destinies. It was not just poverty that built the cage around them. It was stigma, the cruel words of neighbors who kept their distance, who labeled them long before they were ever understood, a family trapped between survival and shame, unable to move forward, yet unwilling to let go of the only life they knew. Generations folded in upon themselves, and each birth carried traces of the past. Voices turned into growls, words into grunts. The language of survival became sounds more primal than civilized, and to outsiders it became the most shocking sign that something had gone terribly wrong in this hidden valley. When the first camera lens turned toward them, it was not to help but to expose, and the images spread like wildfire across television and the internet. People gaped, people stared, people judged, yet few asked why this family lived as they did, why help never came, why their story had been left to rot until it became a spectacle. Behind every bark, every grunt, was not madness, but communication, a desperate attempt to reach out in the only way they knew. Behind every stare was not emptiness, but the reflection of a world that had failed them over and over again. It is too easy to call them cursed, too easy to label them monsters, because that allows the rest of the world to turn away, to treat them like shadows rather than people. But the truth is more uncomfortable. The Whittakers are a mire, raw, a reflection of what happens when society chooses to look away. Their suffering was not born in isolation, alone. It was born in the neglect of the outside world, in the refusal to acknowledge that families like theirs exist hidden in valleys, forgotten by progress, condemned to repeat themselves until someone dares to listen. The world first saw the Whittaker family not through compassion, but through the cold glass of a camera lens. Strangers traveled into the hollers of West Virginia, not to save, not to heal, but to document, to capture the eerie growls, the vacant stares, the strange rhythms of a family that had lived untouched for generations. Those images spread across screens, and people reacted with shock, fascination, even laughter, as if the lives of the Whittakers were nothing more than a sideshow act. But behind those haunting visuals was a truth that few wanted to confront. The truth that society had abandoned them long before the world discovered them. When filmmakers and journalists entered their home, they brought attention, but not change questions, but not solutions. The family was displayed to millions, yet remained trapped in the same shack, in the same valley, with the same struggles. Their story had become entertainment rather than a call for justice. The growls, the barks, the silence were consumed like horror. The internet painted them as a cursed bloodline, but in every movement, in every sound, there was something deeper. There was resilience. There was survival. There was a cry for dignity, buried beneath years of ridicule and misunderstanding. Imagine living in a world where the only language you know is mocked by outsiders. Imagine being filmed not as a human, but as a curiosity. Every whisper of their story became exaggerated, twisted, and reshaped into something darker than it ever was. And with each retelling, their humanity slipped further away. But the Whittaker family did not choose this stage. They did not ask for fame. They were thrust into a spotlight that exposed them to cruelty, the kind of cruelty that can only come from distance, from people who will never step into that valley and see them as more than a mystery. Their story became a warning, a shadow over America, reminding us of the forgotten thee. Ignored the families left behind in hidden places. It became clear that the true horror was not their condition, but the way the world responded with judgment instead of help, with ridicule instead of compassion. The Whittakers remain symbols not of curse, but of neglect. They show us that when humanity abandons its own, the results are not just tragic. They are terrifying, and they force us to ask, who else has been left in the silence of forgotten valleys, unseen, unheard, and unwanted? The story of the Whittaker family does not end with a single documentary or a viral video. It lingers in the air like a ghost, haunting both the hills of West Virginia and the minds of those who dare to look closer. What began as whispers of inbreeding, as tales of a cursed bloodline, has grown into a mirror, a reflection of what society chooses to hide rather than face. Generations of silence created their world. Isolation turned into destiny, and destiny turned into spectacle. Outsiders consumed their lives as if they were fiction, forgetting that behind every strange sound, behind every silent stare, was a human being, breathing, feeling, and enduring the weight of a history they never chose. In their valley, time does not move the way it does for the rest of us. The same wooden house still stands. The same dirt road still winds through the holler. The same shadows linger where children once played, unaware of the eyes of the outside world, waiting to capture their every flaw, their every difference. But their story forces us to ask deeper questions. How many other families have been left behind? How many forgotten towns still hold secrets that the world has turned away from? How many lives are sacrificed in the name of progress, while the powerful look elsewhere, pretending not to see the suffering buried in silence? The Whittakers have become a legend, both feared and pitied. They are spoken about in hushed tones across the internet. Their name passed around like a warning or a curse. Yet behind that myth is a truth more unsettling than any rumor. The truth that neglect breeds horrors greater than any bloodline ever could. Perhaps the true darkness is not the growling, not the silence, not the twisted branches of family lines. Perhaps the true darkness is the way humanity consumes suffering without compassion, turning tragedy into entertainment and pain into stories that entertain rather than awaken. The Whittaker family will always remain a mystery to those who look from the outside, but to those who dare to look deeper. Their existence is not a tale of monsters or curses. It is a tale of abandonment, of the cost of forgetting, of the shadows that grow when society looks away. And so their story lingers like a chill in the air, reminding us that the scariest secrets are never hidden in distant lands or ancient ruins. They are hidden much closer in the places we choose not to look, in the families we choose not to see, in the voices that were silenced long before we ever heard them.